Hello FlossTube, my name is Laura and I am the Nerdy Needle. Today's lesson is all about how to stitch on the diagonal when you're stitching full coverage or almost full coverage pieces. So reviewing what I talked about last time in my first video on how to make your full coverage pieces prettier, I summarized 3 rules for making prettier stitches and cross stitch. So the first rule is making sure you cross your X's the same direction every time. The second rule is to make sure that you change your thread direction every time you cross the fabric. And the third rule is to come up in unoccupied holes or less occupied holes and go down in more occupied holes or occupied holes. So I've actually, in my own stitching, as I've been working on them every evening, I've been reflecting on these rules that I've come up with and have realized that, well, there need to be some modifications depending on the style of stitching that you're doing. And I also have things that I don't have any experience with, so I don't know how these rules apply to them. For example, I suspect that the importance of these rules will be different if you're stitching 1/1 on really small count even weave. It's probably going to be slight differences in how you apply these if you're doing just 10th stitch. So these rules work well for any count of Aida, but beyond that I'm not sure because I haven't done it and I haven't really seen anybody else talk about this in that respect. So other things, when I described how I do the stitching, I described the Danish method. That's the one where you go, you do one leg of the cross and then you come back and do the other leg. So you go, one leg, and then cross them coming back. That's the Danish cross. This would also work with English, which is where you complete each X individually before moving on to the next stitch. For samplers, it's actually really interesting. I've been working on a couple of samplers in my own stitching, and I've noticed that I apply these rules, but I apply them differently when I stitch samplers. So with samplers, because you're stitching on linen, linen is from a completely different plant. It's from the flax plant as opposed to cotton, which is from the cotton plant. I noticed that the linen threads are more flexible. And because I stitch in hand when I stitch samplers, I pay attention to the coming up in unoccupied holes, going down in occupied holes, to the extent that I'm aware that I need to be careful to not split my threads if I do come up in an occupied hole. And I find that I come up in occupied holes a lot. But I'm aware that that's something I need to take a little bit extra care with. And because I'm stitching in hand and the fabric kind of bends, I can manipulate my needle and the fabric so that I can come up cleanly in occupied holes basically every time. I'm actually finding that I get less split threads stitching on linen than I do on stitching on Aida. So being aware that that could potentially be a problem is useful, but certainly it doesn't really, you can certainly get away with it and get perfectly beautiful stitches coming up in occupied holes on linen fabric. That's what I'm finding. I am paying attention to the changing thread direction rule, and I think that's really the key on samplers to making your stitches nice and neat, is to try to avoid elongating your stitches whenever you can. I still do it because the issue is that if I have to travel in some direction, of course sampler stitching is more cross-country than anything else, to be able to completely not do that, I would end up having to do a whole lot more counting, because the way that I cross my X's, I would have to come from top down in rows to avoid elongating my stitches every single time. And that's a lot of counting and a lot of potential mistakes. So I do end up with some elongated stitches when I travel up in like a column, but I do make a point of making sure that I come up in the further hole so that I only have an elongated stitch from the bottom stitch and not from the top. If this doesn't make any sense to you, this is your incentive to go watch my previous video, which talks about how to make your stitches prettier. I have a model there that really describes this, and I think, especially from the comments I've been seeing from fellow stitchers, that it's the explanation works. So that's my experience currently with following my own rules and being the science nerd that I am. When you come up with a set of when you basically come up with a hypothesis, which is essentially what I've done with my 3 rules, your next step is to look for all of the exceptions that your hypothesis doesn't apply to, because that's what good scientists do. So as I'm working now, I'm kind of finding all of the exceptions, all of the corollaries of how to make your stitches pretty, my 3 rules. And the thing that I'm really thinking about now is that there is really only one rule in cross stitch. And I would say that everything is relative in cross stitch. So probably that would be the number 1 rule. So we are basically making pixels on fabric. It's like on a computer screen. And so we compare stitches to other stitches. And if you keep that in mind, that you're comparing one stitch to the stitch next to it and the one above it and the one below it, that's why they need to be uniform. Now, if there's less stitches to compare to, for example, in a sampler where you only have like 1 row or 1 column, then there's less comparison to be had between your stitches. And so things like elongated stitches don't matter so much because there's not a whole lot around to compare. In a full coverage piece, every single stitch is surrounded except for the ones on the edges. So there's a lot more comparison, and you have to take a lot more care, in my opinion, in making sure that your stitches are very, very uniform. So today it's all about stitching on the diagonal. Again, being a scientist, I care about not just showing you how to do it, but why you do it. So the way I'm going to do it this time is there's an easy why, then I'll show you how to do it, and then I'll give you kind of the nerdy explanation of why you would want to stitch on the diagonal. So the easy why you would want to stitch on the diagonal is just because it looks really cool. It's a very dynamic way of seeing your pattern appear. You get more color change, you get hints of what's to come. So you'll hit like a different color on that current diagonal, and so you now have something to look forward to. You got a few stitches of blue, you've parked your thread for the next diagonal, but now you have something to look forward to. You're like, ooh, I wonder how all of those blue, how the blue is going to fit into my pattern. It's even without the other reason why you would do stitching on the diagonal, which is to avoid column or page lines. Even if that was not an issue, I would still strongly recommend that you try stitching on the diagonal, because it's just, you usually don't see images appear on a diagonal. You usually see them appear in rows or columns. And so it's just a different way of seeing your pattern, and I think it's a lot more interesting and engaging. And my big meadow piece that I did, I was actually a monogamous stitcher on that. And I think the reason is because stitching on the diagonal just made it really interesting and engaging, and I never really got tired of it. Now I did, like, because of other stuff in my life, didn't stitch for long periods of time, like months and months, but that was for a different reason. It wasn't because I just got bored of stitching. When I was engaged with my stitching, I looked forward to working on that project every time I picked it up, because, and I think part of it is because of the diagonal. So I'm going to switch over now to showing you some of my diagrams, and we'll talk there. Here is an example of what stitching on the diagonal looks like. This is from my meadow project that I finished a few months ago. In the background, you can see on the fabric there I gridded with sulky sliver, and you can also see my parked threads. But it's a great way of seeing your image appear, even if there was no other reason for stitching on the diagonal. Just for that reason, I would always do this because it's just really cool. I used my Pattern Maker app on my laptop to make a chart, a pattern. This is gibberish. It is not anything from anybody's chart. This is a chart to nothing. It's just a random bunch of colors. All I did was just click on a bunch of symbols and mix them up throughout this grid. The way that I set this up, I did this on purpose. You can see that you've got your 10 by 10 grid lines, and I purposely made it so that the pattern that I made doesn't completely fill the 10 by 10 grid, because that's really the only thing that you need to pay attention to when stitching on the diagonal in your setup, is making sure that when you draw your diagonal, whichever direction you draw it, whether it's this way or that way, and I'll show you which direction you would do it based on which corner you start. So the key here is to make sure that your diagonal line is corner to corner of your 10 by 10 grid. So I used a highlighter to draw these in. So you can see, like right here, I was doing the 10 by 10 grid diagonal not like that. If you do it like this, everything's going to get thrown off, especially if you use pre-gridded fabric or if you've gridded the fabric yourself. So that's really the only thing to pay attention to, is making sure that when you draw that diagonal, that is on the 10 by 10 grid diagonal. This is how you would set it up for how I stitch, which is going left to right, top to bottom. So I start in the upper left corner. So to stitch this, what I would do is start with the little whale. So I would stitch these rows until I get to the bottom, and then I come back and stitch these until I get to the bottom, and so on. If you have a pattern that isn't particularly confetti heavy, then you can certainly stitch 20 stitches across, which is what I do, unless I run into something that's got quite a bit of confetti, and then I reduce it down to 10 stitches across. But I find 20 stitches is a good length to use for the pattern that I'm on right now, that street scene that I'm stitching right now. So that's essentially how you set up your pattern. If you use an electronic, if you use your phone or your iPad or something, your tablet to stitch, I use Goodreader, and the reason why I use Goodreader as my app for my stitching is because it has a feature where you can draw in these diagonal lines, and it's pretty easy and straightforward to do. So what is the pattern for different corner starts? It's actually quite straightforward. So whichever corner you want to start in, that's going to define your triangle. So the right angle of the triangle goes in whichever corner. So that makes, so that's how you would angle your stitches. So a top left start or bottom right start, and this is independent of rows or columns. It would be the same for either one. So you would angle your diagonal the same way for those two or for those two starts. So there's really only two ways that you would angle your diagonals. For those of you who are just looking to find the solution for whichever way that you want to stitch, I've added it to my last lesson. So you can just pause the video and take a screenshot of whichever one of these applies. If the top bits on all of these, besides the diagonal stuff, that's from my previous video. So if you're interested in what all of this is, if you're getting confused by the arrow bits, then go watch my previous video. I guess I'm advertising myself now, to figure out what that's all about. So again, you can just pause and screenshot whichever one applies. So that's bottom to top in rows. And then here's columns. And there you go. So let's talk about my second, more nerdy reason for stitching on the diagonal. I've printed out excerpts from other people's work to illustrate this. It's quite faint, but you can see there's a line straight through the stitching right there. This bottom one, the person who did this is an incredible Haid that someone finished. I'm not going to link the video because I don't want people going and watching somebody's video looking for, you know, the mistake. Well, I wouldn't even say it's a mistake. The issue that this particular stitcher does talk about, but I don't want to send people to a video to look at, you know, where her shortcomings or her it's not a shortcoming, I don't even know what the word would be, the issue in her stitching that she talked about. And that's actually one of the reasons that I really started thinking about this issue, was because of this stitcher. It's hard to see, but you can on her Instagram page you can definitely see that there are column lines in here. They're very faint. I think that from a distance, unless you were looking for it, you probably wouldn't see it. This one's a little bit more dramatic right here. So you'll often hear people refer to this as column lines or page lines. I haven't seen anybody talking about row lines, which would make sense that you would see, you know, lines for where you stopped stitching rows, but that doesn't seem to be an issue for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe visually we're just more attuned to vertical lines versus horizontal. I'm not quite sure. So I have a theory about why this is happening. So what causes column or page lines? Well, there's a few things that you can look at. Is it the embroidery floss or is it the fabric? So in the embroidery floss, it could be a variation in the floss color, which quite frankly, with something like DMC or Anchor or any of those threads is basically unheard of. So I don't think variation in floss color works. Variation in stitch tension, I don't think that's really happening either. For a stitcher to have completed this much, they've got their tension down. I mean, you're not going to complete this many stitches and not have pretty consistent tension in your stitches. So I really don't think that's the issue. What I think it is that it's just in the fabric, that you're distorting your fabric with unbalanced stitch tension. So if you think about what your stitches look like, here are some stitches. I couldn't figure out how to get Word to not put rows in between. It's not, I don't know. It gets the point across. So this would be a thread in your fabric, in the Aida or even weave that you're using. So as you're placing your X's, you're pulling in both directions on this individual thread, which means that your tension on your fabric is going to be even there. If you are, if you stitch up to an edge, if you stitch up to a vertical edge, what you're doing is all of these stitches are putting tension in one direction on this one thread in your fabric. And that results in that uneven tension, which distorts your fabric. This is from the edge of my big meadow piece. Again, it's really subtle, but you can see this is washed and ironed, but you can kind of see there's a bit of a shadow here because there is a little bit of distortion in this fabric. There's a little tiny bit of wave in this fabric. So if I continued stitching this pattern, I suspect that you would be able to see a faint line right there from the fact that there's been tension on this thread in the Aida right on the edge, and there's all of these stitches pulling on this one Aida thread, pulling this direction, And so I think that that's causing a very, very slight distortion of the fabric, but just enough for there to be a visible column line. So the solution for this, I've seen people stagger their edges, so they'll go up and back and down like this, so they'll kind of stagger back and forth on an edge. That would alleviate this problem. Stitching on the diagonal is the other way to alleviate this problem. And because stitching on the diagonal looks really cool, I would always do it. Even without this issue, I would still stitch on the diagonal on my full coverage pieces. So that in a nutshell is how to stitch on the diagonal. The next lesson will be, or the next tutorial will be on the actual how to do parking, what is parking, how do you do it, and then how I do parking with leaving my needles threaded. I hope you found this helpful.